This is episode 19 of Old Man Yells, and I'm Bob Burnett. Today, we're going to explore a topic called collective denial. And we're going to use history kind of as the base of what we're going to explore here. We'll start with a story of somebody named Hiroo Onoda. And as background information, before we get into Hiroo's specifics, pre-World War II, the Philippines was a U.S. territory. It held the same status as Guam and Hawaii and Puerto Rico. There were about 130,000 active military personnel under U.S. command there. And this was the state of the world before World War II started. So on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked the U.S. forces in Pearl Harbor, there were 130,000 people in the Philippines who became greatly exposed. And unfortunately, on December 8th, something very catastrophic happened for these people. In fact, history might well be better told through the perspective of what happened on December 8th than through what happened on December 7th. Because starting on December 8th, the Japanese put the full force of their military into an invasion of the Philippines. It was a massive 40-day siege, and about 120,000 people were either killed or captured as a result of it. By far the largest set of casualties in U.S. history, and also the only time in which U.S. sovereign territory was captured and invaded by enemy forces. It culminated with General MacArthur famously standing in the shores of the Philippine Sea as he was about to flee to Australia, making a famous speech that begins, "I shall return." And he did return, thankfully, and the U.S. did ultimately, obviously, retake the Philippines, but a lot happened in between. Now, in 1942, Hiroo Onoda was a 20-year-old Japanese man. He was conscripted into the Japanese army and sent to train in guerrilla warfare. He had reached the rank of second lieutenant by December of 1944 when he was deployed to Lubang Island in the Philippines. It's about a 48 square mile piece of very rugged land, 70 miles southwest of Manila. Now, as he went off into his mission, his commander told him, "Whatever happens, we will come back for you." Words that did much more damage than good, as you shall soon see. Now, by this time, late 1944, Japan was already losing its stronghold in the Philippines, and Hiroo had been sent there with a team of 3 other people with the mission of essentially causing a nuisance to the Allied forces there. This occurred apparently very successfully for the next several months, when on August 6th and August 9th, respectively, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And a week later, the Japanese surrendered to the Allies. Now, Hiroo and his team were not alone in being alone. The Philippines has 7,100 islands, and similar things were occurring everywhere, where there were very kind of disassociated, isolated groups of soldiers who didn't have a great means to get communication back from Central Command. So Allied forces started dropping leaflets all through the islands saying the war is over. Most of the people believed them and surrendered their arms and went back with and moved on with life. But Hiroo was a very convicted person, and he came from a belief that he should never surrender and the Japanese would never surrender. It was ingrained in him so much that Before he had left, his mother had given him a knife. And the knife was so that if he was ever in a position where he was going to be captured, he was supposed to commit suicide. That was the directive from his own mother. So, on this initial volley of leaflets, they just deemed them fake and a trick. After a little bit of time, the villagers became irritated by what was happening, so they started leaving notes saying, hey, the war is over, come on out. Then late in 1945, the Japanese, knowing that some of the soldiers still had not surrendered, had a surrender order prepared from General Yamashita, a written surrender order, and they dropped those via leaflets throughout the entire islands to try to get to everybody. Well, by this point, everybody did basically give up except for Hiroo and his crew. They did find the leaflets, but they deemed them not genuine. The villagers continued for several years to continue to leave these notes saying, please give up, please stop being a nuisance to us, because they were losing livestock and losing food and having clothes stolen, and all those sort of things were going on. But Hiroo and his team did not give up. Finally, in 1950, one of the members of the group, a private Akatsu, got separated from the group and lost in the jungle. And having no other choice for survival, surrendered himself to the villagers. This had some very negative consequences, unfortunately. While Private Akatsu went on with his life, he also did know that the Hiroo and the remaining two members of the team were still there. And he wanted to help them. He wanted to convince them to give up. So he went to the families of each of these soldiers. They collected letters and photos and pleas from the families for Hiroo and these other gentlemen to surrender. These things were then airdropped in positions where Hiroo and his group could read them. This continued all the way until 1952. However, Hiroo and his team viewed Private Akatsu as a traitor. They thought he had betrayed them and deserted them, not that he had gotten lost. And so they believed nothing that came from him. In fact, they were more likely to disbelieve what was presented from Private Akatsu than they were to believe it. Now, if we pause for a second, we realize it's 1952. The war had ended in 1945. 7 years have passed. These men are living in hell. They've had multiple messages from the Allied forces, from the Japanese government, from their families. They've had no communication from the Japanese command, no direct communication of any sort. By this point, the fighting was essentially over. They were not running into anybody. Years had gone by. They had no armed conflicts. Any rational person would deduce that the war really was over. But this is the problem. Groupthink had invaded their little group now of three. Any suppressing opinion, or any opinion that was dissenting, was suppressed. Any questioning within the group was suppressed. They're in complete isolation. There's no new information coming in, so they're in echo chamber. They have this long-held belief that Japan was superior, that it would never surrender. And they had become so invested in their position, so emotionally invested in this position, that maybe to a certain degree their identity was now being tied to this. It was their life purpose. If the war really had been over in 1945, they now were in a position of being terribly embarrassed, terribly depressed that they had wasted all of this time. All of this put together creates a classic case of collective denial. A few more years passed, and unfortunately, in 1954, the Philippine Army happened to be holding some training exercises in this region. A conflict erupted between Hiroo's crew and the Philippine forces, and one of the three remaining members, Corporal Shimada, was killed. This had the unfortunate effect of not only killing Corporal Shimada, but now they had a reinforcement that maybe the war really was on. It wasn't true, of course, but this really reinforced this belief that they had that the war was still on, and it fueled their denial. I find this next part almost hard to tell, but another 18 years passed. Two remaining soldiers, Lieutenant Onoda and a private Kozuka, were now desperate. It's 1972. They're desperate for some sort of connection to the outside world, especially to the Japanese forces. They found some large rice piles in a village, part of a harvest, most likely. And they needed to signal, they wanted to signal to the Japanese command that they were still alive and they were still awaiting their instructions about what to do next. So they set the rice piles on fire. This was kind of a straw that broke the camel's back for the villagers and the local authorities. So the local authorities sent out the local police force into the jungle to hunt these guys down. Now, they didn't know, honestly, that they were still Japanese forces. They just knew that there was somebody out there raising havoc. So they were successful in eventually killing Private Kozuka, meaning that Hiroo was the last man standing alone in the Philippine jungle. Fast forward to 1974. It's now approaching 30 years since the end of the war. Rumors had persisted, kind of like almost mythical, in the Philippines, and of course they rippled back to Japan, that maybe there was still somebody in the jungle. And this caught the ear of a Japanese explorer. His name was Norio Suzuki. And Suzuki decided he would go searching for this lost soldier. For him, it was very much like searching for the Yeti or the abominable snowman or the Loch Ness monster. You know, that was the thought then, that this was some mythical thing. Well, he ventured into Lubang Island and spent only 4 days when he found Onoda. He presented Onoda with, of course, all the evidence that the war was over. But astonishingly, Onoda still refused to surrender. He insisted that he must receive orders from his superior, a Major Taniguchi, in order to surrender. And so Suzuki traipsed out of the jungle, flew back to Japan, told of his adventures in finding Hiroo. Luckily was able to find Major Taniguchi still alive and convince him to get on a plane and fly back to the Philippines, where they ventured into the jungle. And Taniguchi was able to present Hiroo Onoda to Major Taniguchi, at which point Taniguchi issued a formal order for Onoda to resign. There's an excerpt from a book where Onoda talks about how he felt at that point. And he has this part where he's first in utter belief that they really lost the war. And then he says, everything went black. A storm raged inside me. What had I been doing for all these years? He said. Just imagine the sense of loss. But he was a soldier to the end. And and even though he was battling this tremendous disappointment, he didn't feel his assignment was complete until he gave a report on all of his missions for the previous almost 30 years to Major Taniguchi. So he started with a chronological account detailing to Major Taniguchi everything that had happened in all of his missions and all of his reconnaissance for 30 years. After a few hours, Taniguchi ordered Onoda to stop and said, hey, let's just get some sleep. You don't need to tell me this. But Onoda, he couldn't do that. And literally, they stayed up through the night to the dawn with Onoda telling Taniguchi about all of their missions and all of their reconnaissance. Only then was the war over for Hiroo Onoda. The actual count was 10,416 days after the formal surrender that it was over for Hiroo Onoda. So why, Bob, are you telling this story? Well, I think we are now living in a world where we fester this groups that are very prone to collective denial. And there can be an idea or a belief or a project or a cause around which an irrational alliance occurs. I think social media allows groups to form very quickly and echo chambers to form where they recycle messages and reinforce each other and completely discount everything coming in from the outside world. It often leads to people's friendships, relationships, and even their own identity being centered on that very belief. And once that happens, there's a cognitive dissonance that can set in, and the emotional and financial ties to this belief can become so strong that the success of that idea, the importance of the success of that idea, becomes existential to that person. So I think many groups like this already exist. For some, it can be something like the flat earthers that obviously insist that the earth is not round, and they have created communities where they convince each other that the world is wrong and that any evidence being presented to them to the contrary is deception. You see this with things like did man land on the moon? Did like these sort of causes where they take whatever evidence they can cobble together that reinforces that idea and filter out everything that doesn't. The level of cognizant dissonance can sometimes be jaw-dropping. Now, often when things reach this level, it's where the world starts saying, cult, cult, cult. You're in a cult. And in the Bitcoin world, I think we have some active cases of collective denial. The most obvious ones are the Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV groups. They're very much like Hiroo Onoda and his crew in the Philippine jungle. For those less familiar with Bitcoin's history, Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV were born in the block size wars of 2017 and 2018. And while there was a technical center to them, really around the block size, There was really something more fundamental. It had to do with the soul of Bitcoin, the mission of Bitcoin, that created three distinct groups, each with their own feelings about what those things were. But the market very quickly proclaimed one, what we call Bitcoin, BTC, as the king. Now, it wasn't clear for a short period what would happen, especially relative to Bitcoin Cash, but within a year, it was very obvious what would be the winner. And now we sit here 7 years later with BTC at 200 times the value of Bitcoin Cash and 2,000 times the value of BSV. And even beyond the market cap dominance, the funding of the hash rate, the corporate treasuries, the legal tender status, the amount of attention it gets in political circles and media circles, all these sorts of things are clear evidence that there really only is Bitcoin, and that the Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV groups are really in a feudal position. It's very clear to those outside the circle of the Bitcoin Cash and the Bitcoin SV people that they are in a very similar status to Hiroo. And while I respect that some of these people really believed in their cause, much like Hiroo did, whether they were right and just or not is no longer relevant. They lost. They're now wandering in a virtual digital asset jungle without ties to the outside world, without any hope really of the outside world hearing their message or globbing onto their message. As time goes by, I think there's a distinct possibility that, for instance, the gold community, the gold bug community, could set itself up for something very similar, where they fail to see the benefit of Bitcoin, and that Bitcoin is solving many, if not all, of the same problems and more that they believed in, that gold would solve. This collective denial definitely exists within that group. It's a collective denial, not necessarily that they've lost, because I think the gold world still has value, but they're in collective denial that there is an up-and-comer and that Bitcoin has a legitimacy, because admitting that it has this legitimacy erodes, their very position. So what can we learn from this? I think collective denial is very real. Its grip can be tremendous. And the tighter and more isolated the group, the more accepting of defeat and surrendering will be. And I think one of the things that happens, for instance, with the Bitcoin SV and the Bitcoin Cash communities, is they've become very, very isolated. A small, relatively small group of people, each telling each other, it's okay, we're going to win, when all of the obvious signs are pointing elsewhere. But as Bitcoin's impact on the world gets bigger and more groups and visions and belief systems are impacted by it, I think we'll find more and more cases of collective denial. This could be from central bankers. As much as I dislike central bank, I believe there are many people within the central banks that believe they're there with a noble cause and that they're doing the right things. There's the Keynesian economics groups, the MMTers, the wealth and financial advisors who have been saying for a long time that their clients should stay away from Bitcoin, that it's a speculative asset, that it's a bubble, that it's a Ponzi. These sort of things kind of fester and create these environments. I think many will find it hard to accept, and many will hold on well past the expiration date of whatever cause that they are with. It's why, in a weird way, I can respect somebody like Larry Fink at BlackRock, because Larry was a denier. He was a strong denier. He was in a circle of people that were reinforcing this belief against Bitcoin. But to his credit, he had the courage, maybe with a lot of financial incentives, but he had the courage to break away from it, say, I was wrong, and surrender. As Bitcoiners, a lot of times when we face people who don't understand what we're saying, and they're part of one of these collective denial groups that are impacted by Bitcoin, we react in a very toxic and impatient way. And I think when we do that, what we do is we actually push them harder into their position. I think we have to be realistic that it's very unlikely that somebody in the state of collective denial is going to suddenly listen to us and open up. There's too much that's closed. But I do think we could do a much better job as a community of being a little more understanding and a little more compassionate. But as part of that, we also have to realize that we can't waste much time at it. It took 28 years for Lieutenant Onoda to surrender. So we can't waste too much energy trying to save somebody that's in the throes of a collective denial. But I do think it's imprudent on us to make it less toxic and less difficult for them to actually surrender.